All right, good afternoon, everyone. Let's get started. We have a really great opportunity to hear from an internationally respected researcher and scholar on the topic of counterterrorism. I hope everyone had an opportunity to enjoy a couple of the sessions during the Future of Work conference. It's something that we're really proud to do here in the School of Business Administration. And every year, we want to keep adding new topics and kind of pushing that envelope to make sure that we're preparing our community with the knowledge they need to be successful in their careers. Before I get started, I want to make sure I thank a couple people who helped make this possible. Karen Friel, the administrative support staff member in the dean's office, has been instrumental in helping us. Assistant Dean John Reagan, he's trying not to make eye contact with me because he hates public recognition. John essentially took the reins and helped plan this entire event. So John, thank you so much for your work. The two associate deans in the School of Business Administration, Dr. Donna McCluskey and Dr. Jose Parenza, they really help envision what happens at this conference. We get faculty input. We talk to business leaders, industry leaders about interesting topics. And so Donna and Jose, thank you for helping to imagine this entire conference that we put on. For those of you who have been with us and going to these Future of Work conferences with us over the last couple of years, we have a really, really great line of really distinguished keynote speakers, and I'm really excited to introduce our keynote speaker, who I'm happy to call a friend. For those of you who were at the first real iteration, we tried a rapid prototype of this conference during COVID. So we did some stuff during homecoming week, and then we came back from COVID, and we actually ran this conference outside, which was kind of fascinating to do. And at that first real full-fledged conference we did, Rod Smola, who was the dean of the Delaware Law School at the time, gave the keynote address. And Rod has argued cases in front of the Supreme Court. He is considered one of the preeminent defamation lawyers, First Amendment lawyers in the country. And Rod gave a talk about defamation, especially kind of in moving into a digital age. Last year, I'm sure you remember, we had Dr. Dirk Wirth from the A.W. Scheer Institute of Digital Transformation in Saarbrücken gave a talk. And he, as well as this internationally recognized leader in his field. And so today, we have another great opportunity to hear from, I'll say it, probably the most respected scholar, at least in the United States, on the topic of counterterrorism research. I'm fortunate I went to graduate school with Dr. Gina Ligon, who I'll be reading her bio, and she's trying to act like she also is not here at this moment, but I've known Gina for over 20 years at this point, and the opportunity to invite her to talk about the work she does, but again in this age of digital transformation and how it's affecting her research institute and the work that they do. I read the Washington Post every day. It's the newspaper I grew up reading as a kid, and someone once told me, if you want to be a well-informed person, pick a newspaper, any newspaper, and read it every day. And I've been doing that probably since I was 8 or 9 years old, which might explain me in a lot of ways to some of you. And so here I am one day a couple of years ago reading the Washington Post. On the artist formerly known as Twitter, I see this picture of my friend Gina. And the Washington Post did this multiple thousand-word biography on her and the work that she is doing. So of course I sent her a message and I was like, oh my God, you're in the Washington Post. She's been everywhere. You can see her. She gets quoted often. She's seen often, and especially with what's happening now, currently in the world right now, with what's happening in Gaza and in Israel, her expertise is being called upon regularly. So now for the formal stuff with all the names and the titles, Dr. Gina Ligon is the Jack and Stephanie Koraleski Professor of Collaboration Science and Professor of Management at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. This research institute that she runs, she's the director of the National Counterterrorism Innovation Technology and Education NCITE. See, I'm getting some of it. Is the lead institution of a consortium of over 20 universities in the United States that do research on counterterrorism. And so it is Gina's job and her role partially to coordinate and collaborate nationwide efforts on counterterrorism research. Gina received her Ph.D. in industrial organizational psychology with a minor in quantitative psychology, which is statistics. That's what we used to call it back in the day, at the University of Oklahoma. Her research program focuses on the identification and development of high-level talent. She has specific expertise in innovation and leadership and has published over 70 peer-reviewed journal articles and book chapters on these subjects. Her research agenda also includes organizational structures and leadership in non-normative organizations, which I have a feeling we'll hear a little more about what that means. I am so happy and so honored to introduce Dr. Gina Ligon as our keynote speaker for our Future of Work conference. Thank you.
So much. Thank you. Tony was worried about the turnout, and this is a wonderful turnout. Thank you so much for taking your time this afternoon to be here. Very happy and grateful for being on this beautiful campus, having the provost here, and getting to meet all of you and these wonderful students that come to Widener. So thank you so much. I redid my slides this week. Some stuff's been happening in the world, and so I wanted to make sure that I gave a nod to the current events that are happening in Israel, but also to make sure that you all know that at the end of this, I have some time for question and answer, so we can talk about anything that's not on the slides as well. But the first slide I wanted to share with you is something that happened on last Saturday in Israel. So that is a commercial-grade drone that was used to deliver improvised explosive devices along the wall on Israel to hit some of the security guards that were watching for intrusions into their space. The use of drones is not a novel tactic that is used by terrorist organizations, but it was novel that day in that space. What's also not novel is the use of commercial drones, UASs, to deliver packages. And so the conference sponsor, UPS, we don't have anyone from there right here now, they also have the similar model drone that they are piloting to drop packages at houses. And so I thought, what a great example for this conference and business students specifically to think about how innovations that you use for your workplaces, for the future of work, could have malign uses, and for you to design them with security in mind and to be thinking about other people that are also watching your innovations and how they might use them. So my job today is to talk to you a little bit about three different future of work trends that I think are going to impact national security, specifically counterterrorism. I am the director of the nation's largest counterterrorism research consortium. We have 27 universities in it. Widener's not in it yet, sir, so if there's anyone here that's interested in proposing to be in our consortium, I'd love to talk to you about it. We do have Temple as a Philadelphia. There's a researcher who researches neo-Nazis who is in the criminology department at Temple who has a really important project that we're funding right now. We have 27 academic institutions. We have over 60 Ph.D.s and 530 students that are participating in education projects across the country on behalf of this work. So we're sponsored by Department of Homeland Security. Our job is to be able to help every major in the nation, in the United States, see how their particular discipline and expertise can contribute to national security. It's a really important mission. There's no actual degree in counterterrorism. It's such a complex issue that you really need all hands on deck. You need all of us to be thinking about this and thinking about how it has implications for our work. And so when I think about what I'm doing here today, it's to hopefully inspire some of you to maybe use some of your talents in your academic training here at Widener, some things that you learned this morning about how to keep us safe and keep your community safe as well. So what I'll do is I'll talk about those three trends and some of the consequences of them, but then I'll leave you with some hope. And that is, what are your roles, or what could be your roles as future business leaders, academics, educators in this space, to be able to keep your personal community safe, but also design with security in mind. So before I get into that, it'd be hard to talk at a terrorism talk and not talk to you about different types of terrorist groups, right? So I'm going to quickly go through these with some high levels, just so we're all on the same page, because when I talk about terrorist use of malign technology, I need to make sure you understand what I mean by a terrorist. And so first we'll start with the international terrorists. So these are a lot of times emanating outside of our border. My role at Homeland Security is really to focus on those that have intent on harming U.S. persons, but there's, to be candid, many more terrorist attacks outside of the U.S. In countries against other types of populations than there are in the United States. So the first type that a lot of you might be familiar with, you see pictures here from 9/11, you also see some pictures from the Islamic State. So these are groups who are trying to achieve an ideological goal that's aligned with a certain interpretation of religion. So not a certain religion, because a lot of these groups will bastardize the type of religion that they are acting on behalf of, but they are certainly doing this on behalf of religious ideals. And so foreign terrorist organizations such as Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State would be exemplars of those. The second one are nationalists. This is actually the PIRA. So these are groups that have a goal of establishing a nationalist state or holding territory or increasing their territory. What's interesting about the current conflict in Israel right now is it's kind of a mix between religious and nationalist ideals. And so you see a call to arms from Hamas, whose original goal was to take back physical territory. But they're also calling to arms for all people against people of the Jewish faith or people in the West. So that has a mix of both those ideals mixed in. So they're not as clean of categories, but it's helpful for you to think about, like, what goals are they trying to achieve? And then the third one is something called issue specific. So this is the Animal Liberation Front. They're actually all over, but eco-terrorists, Animal Liberation Front, any kind of issue that they're trying to achieve. The key is that they're trying to enact violence on their target, and their target is usually symbolic of a broader class of people that they're trying to instill fear in or get some sort of action around. So Animal Liberation Front, their ideology is all around the mistreatment of animals. And so they'll do things, this is a puppy mill that they freed the dogs. But they also do a lot of, they're called direct action, so destruction to property. They can do fires of mink mills and places that engage in any kind of animal processing. So those are some of your broader kind of international terrorism categories, how we think about it. But there's also domestic violent extremism. So the three I'll talk about here today, and I'll use the terms that Department of Homeland Security uses because that is who sponsors our center, and it's good for everyone to be on the same page with different terms. But the most lethal and persistent threat to the United States are something called RIMV, racially and ethnically motivated violent extremists. So these, by all intensive terms, are white supremacists. They have killed the most people in the United States since 9/11. And have the most types of attacks against people of color, against immigrants, against people with different sexual orientations. You name it, they are trying to create a white master race. So that is RIMV groups. Some of the phone calls I did this morning were actually about some neo-Nazi swastika papering that happened actually in Philadelphia last night. So people, they are alive and well, and they are using this current conflict and call against people of the Jewish faith to try to marshal sympathies for their cause in America as we speak. And every state actually has an investigation about this, so it's not just in the South or the West or places like Nebraska where I'm from, but it's actually every state has different RIMV groups or inspired individuals in it. So it is the most lethal and persistent threat to the US. The second type are something called agave, which is not a plant. It's anti-government, anti-authority violent extremists. And so these are people who they kind of have lumped two different categories together, but anti-government would be like people that were associated with the Capitol insurrection. So again, trying to overthrow the government or against government institutions and symbols of that government. So that could be military, police, law enforcement. Sovereign citizens are a pretty interesting type of ideology there. They don't believe that any government has any kind of control over them. So there's quite a few sovereign citizens across Pennsylvania that I've studied to try to understand their motivations and how they organize and what kind of threats they could pose to our communities here. The anti-authority, you see the picture of the Starbucks in Philadelphia that had some destruction to it. So these are going to be anti-capitalist, anti-police, a different type of extremist here. Again, it's not about holding the belief system, it's about acting violently on behalf of it, right? So that's when they become the purview of someone who looks at national security. So you can have ideas and beliefs that, you don't like the current police structure, but when you start destroying property or hurting people, that's when you cross the line into becoming what we would call a domestic violent extremist. And then the last group here, we call them issue specific. I hate that term, but thank you, DHS. And so they can, any issue that they have. So these pictures are individuals who were killed by an incel. Has anyone heard about what an incel is? Involuntary celibate. So this was the hot yoga studio in Florida, Tallahassee, where they came in, the man came in and shot up because his target was to hurt women, because this ideology is all built upon women denying sexual advances and relationships with men, and so they have a whole subculture where they are talking about how to eliminate women from positions of power. So incels is an issue-specific example in the United States. So I know I went through those very quickly, but I think the summary capstone of all of those is that they are individuals who are engaging in violence as a tactic to strike fear in the targets of people that are representative of something related to their ideological goal. So non-state actors, I actually don't study countries or militaries or use of force. I study the individuals who use these tactics to achieve their political goals. So I wanted to at least get us a baseline when I talk about terrorists that people can think about what I'm referring to a terrorist versus someone who might use terrorist behavior, which is a little different. The last category that I think transcends all of these and is really important to punctuate for all of you is something called an accelerationist ideology. So this is Brandon Russell. He was recently arrested again for trying to attack the power grid in Maryland. So these individuals are trying to accelerate a civil war for whatever cause it is that they believe in. So whether it be a race war, whether it be anti-government, whether it be issue-specific. So you see accelerationist trains across all the ideologies I just shared. And they are always looking, they're like the conspiracy theorists, they're always looking for signs that the race war is starting. So one of the things, that the end of times war is starting. One of the things that we just saw was the intrusion with Israel and Palestine right now with what's happening in the Gaza region is narrative across a host of different ideological extremist websites talking about this is it. This is the, everybody get, this is what we've been waiting for. And so accelerationists are groups that try to accelerate fighting to end current life as we know it so something else can replace it. So they, for me, as a American, I feel particularly nervous about them. They're trying to attack targets like the power grid, more critical infrastructure, cyber attacks, to try to foment more chaos here. So why am I talking about this at a Future of Work conference other than Tony asked me to? And whenever Tony asks you to do anything, you just do it, right? I'm talking about all of this because I think you all are in a position studying the future of work to help this in a way that the government can't. I think that all of us have a job of keeping our community safe, keeping our companies safe, and the more people we can get thinking about alternative uses, if you will, or alternative third-order effects of technology that we adopt or endorse, I think the stronger we'll be. My faculty appointment is actually in the College of Business. That's where my tenure home is. That's what I've studied my whole career. I study terrorist groups and then I teach business students, and so it's a natural fit for me to be at this conference and talk to you all about it. So the first trend I wanted to talk to you about was the fodder of several of your sessions today, and that is the emergence of new technology and how it's used for improving work, right? I'm not trying to say like don't do any of this or let's overregulate it. I just think as you're using it to think about some of the second order effects. So what I'll do with each of these trends is talk to you about the 2 or 3 that I think are most important and what the consequences are for extremism. So the first one, emerging tech. So there's 2 that I'm interested in and we have active research on as it relates to extremism. The first one, of course, is generative AI, which we've talked a lot about in this conference. We've heard about it used as, it's like having 10,000 experts in your pocket, right? Being able to decrease the barrier for getting things done with expertise and training because you have access to it and you can do that much more quickly. The consequences of generative AI, as you can imagine, is that before terrorist groups, when they wanted to, for example, have a chemical weapons expert, they would have to recruit someone with chemical expertise, right? And so now you have that in things like ChatGPT, where people don't need an actual human to do that. So one of the more recent pieces that we've been looking at is the novelty of different malign uses of ChatGPT, and can you array those? Like, are they truly novel and innovative? So it's one thing to like come up with a bunch of surprises, but it's another thing to actually design an attack or something that could actually be used and effective. And so the most recent one was one that I have on the slide talking about when they asked what were all the different combinations of chemicals that could be harmful. And the original intent of that whole question was for bomb experts to be able to go in and know if someone had purchased an array of different chemicals, what are they likely dealing with? And so it was actually designed to help us to fight against chemical warfare. But then what happened is you realize that this could be in the hands of anyone who would like to be able to do that. There's another example that's interesting about this is the meal bot for planning different recipes, but it's also they asked about what are all the recipes you could plan that would be toxic to people using all the ingredients in my house. So they're trying to make sure that they don't actually make something toxic, but then what happens is they're able to use homemade off-the-shelf things to make toxic recipes very quickly. So that's a significant consequence of AI that I don't think the developers of it really intended. A second emerging technology trend that I wanted to talk about is something called extended reality. So this is that suite of different metaverse type realities: extended reality, virtual reality, mixed reality, augmented reality, that are really just encompass this construct of the blending of the physical and digital world. And one of the examples that I like to talk about with this is what happened on 9/11, in that we as Americans were trying to decrease the cost of training pilots in airplanes, and so we designed flight simulators, right? So pilots, you could democratize pilot training, and people could do that in a much more inexpensive, easy to access way, and we could train more pilots. Lo and behold, if you went back to the 9/11 Commission report, you can see that 3 of the pilots who were part of the 9/11 attacks, where they flew airplanes into buildings, had trained in these flight simulators all around the East Coast. One was actually in Philadelphia. And so they were training on how to fly the plane, but not how to land it. And there was no barrier to them being able to access that training other than the price of being able to pay for lessons in that flight simulator. So this was this idea of like, we're designing this so we can get more pilots in our airlines and our Air Force, but then the alternative use is the bad guys could also use it, right? And so for us, for this particular work with extended reality, this is an example of a new flight simulator that actually fits in your house. It's like showing underneath a console. So if you think about all the barriers we have put up, so people when they're engaging in flight training have to do all kinds of registration, and we're really good at like protecting against threats that we've already faced. But this is a novel threat, right? Of like if someone's going to build this in their house, they can learn how to fly a plane very easily. So the implications that we talk about, we have some active research projects on terrorist use of the metaverse, gaming, and artificial intelligence that we sponsor at our center. I think some of the main consequences that we think about as it relates to terrorism is increased access of planning. So that's with the AI technologies and being able to reduce the amount of expertise that you need. And so planning about attacks is one increase, and then the second increase that we're seeing is training. And the other related one that we have some new projects on is about if you think about as humans, we're trying to get people to trust the machine, like in your workplaces, like if you have an automated partner, you want your employees to trust them. If we are also doing that, if you think about trying to make these avatars as trustworthy people as possible, think about you could design the ideal recruiter to go in and be Osama bin Laden trying to recruit you all over again with like the exact recruiting message that you needed because he was fake, right? We designed him online. So those are some of the implications that we think for emerging tech that we're concerned about with extremists. But I didn't want to just talk about emerging tech as a workforce trend because, like Tony, I am an IO psychologist, so I also think about workforce and HR. So another trend that I wanted to talk about is this rising trend of remote and hybrid workers, as well as reduction in organizational commitment. So the first one with remote work, I mean, one of it's here to stay. I'm not saying it's not, and we should make everyone come back to work because I think there's tons of benefits. There's lots of research from Forbes that say that remote workers are more productive, that are saying that the remote workforce is reducing costs for real estate for companies. So there's lots of benefits to that. People are able to focus on their task as opposed to all the ancillary things that go along with work. The consequence of that, though, I will say, is that as work becomes more transactional in nature, right, as we just focus on using work to get tasks done, we also lose our connection to that institution and the institution of trust, right? So the role that organizations have in our society and the people that are around us that we get to meet day to day, you don't have that when you are a completely remote workforce. And so how can we as companies and business leaders think about ways to have a remote workforce and all the benefits of that, but not reduce people's organizational commitment? And that's the second trend to talk about is just the transitory nature of people's, and this has been going on for a while, but people's commitment to certain organizations. The Korn and Ferry study just released that said the average tenure for people that just graduated in the last 5 years is 2 years in a company, which is like alarming to me as someone who, I think the shortest I've ever worked at a job was 3 years, and it was Taco Mayo when I was a teenager. So, it's like this whole notion of there's not as much commitment to organizations anymore, that people are looking for jobs, they're always looking for their next job, and the implications of that. There's a construct that extremism researchers study in other countries, right? Because that's where terrorism happens, but I think you could see it happening here. And that is this construct of anomie, which is when people no longer have their norms and routines and stability that having an institutional connection has, they're more vulnerable to recruitment from extremist groups. So one of my biases as an org psychologist is that we as humans are a clan species. We love people, we love humans, we love to work in groups. And so as we are decreasing our attachment to organizations, what types of organizations could rise up in those places? Because if we have a need to be around people, for me, the so what is the extremist organizations are organized, and they do give you a sense of meaning, and they do give you a connection to other people. And so just being cognizant of the role that business actually plays in providing resilience against these groups recruiting people. And then the last trend I'll talk about, and I'm going to just fully lay out my bias here because obviously I work in an academic institution. An academic institution is who flew me here. And we are all obviously supporters of academic institutions. What we are seeing right now is this decrease in the value of higher ed and the rhetoric of that from lots of different sources, but particularly some extremist group sources. An attack on higher ed is a full front strategy of part of those anti-government, anti-authority violent extremist groups that I showed you. It is part of their plan is to degrade trust in public institutions, government, higher ed, and the financial system. And so we as higher ed are under attack from extremists. Now, some of the consequences of that I think are kind of playing out in non-extremist value of what higher ed can do for them. So you all have seen this trend of skills-based hiring. There was a Gallup poll that showed, a LinkedIn poll that showed last year since 2022, the amount of job ads that had requirements of a college degree had decreased by 21%. And so what they were doing was saying that that was preferred, but not necessarily required, and instead doing things like skills-based hiring. So do you have critical thinking skills? Do you have a particular computer skill that you would need to do coding? And they would just train you once you got onto the job. I'm not saying that those campaigns were all started by extremists. Please don't think I'm trying to make that connection. But I think this rhetoric about decreasing the value of higher education has some nefarious third-order effects. One of which is, what happens when you're in college? I see all these people in the audience who are, in their early 20s. This is a formative time in your life. And being able to learn how to engage in critical thinking, to work on teams in your MBA program with people you don't like. You learn how to work with people that aren't your friends, which is a huge part of our resilience as a society. But you also bump into people who are different from you and have different backgrounds. And there's no other time in your life when you're going to have that kind of exposure to diversity of thought and diversity of background that you do in college. And so there's a reason these extremists don't want us to go to college, because they are dependent on having a singular interpretation of a worldview without people critically evaluating the veracity of the picture that they're painting. And so when you go to college and you learn about how to check sources, and you learn about disinformation and media literacy, and you learn how to talk to people who are different from you, you are creating resilience for yourself and for other people around this extremist rhetoric that's out there about cause and effect. One example that I shared earlier about with the anti-government, anti-authority violent extremists is their attack on DEI initiatives, diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. And so one of the narratives that they are using and combined with the RIMV, the white supremacist groups, is that DEI is a way to replace white voters and white people in positions of power. If you don't go to college and understand that that is actually not what DEI initiatives are doing, and you can't have that critical thinking to counter those arguments, they're very persuasive in how they talk about it. They're very logical, and if you don't have the counterfacts to understand what DEI initiatives are actually doing, then you and others like you could become vulnerable to those types of narratives. And so I'm very concerned about higher ed's role in our society, and not just for my own job. I'm concerned about it for our resilience and our ability to counter violent extremism. Education is a correlate of, lack of education is a correlate of people being involved in extremism. It's not causal, but you're more likely to be vulnerable to these types of narratives if you haven't got the less education you've pursued outside of high school. And so part of that is because of what is happening right here, that you all are getting to talk to people that are different from you, and you're getting to learn how to fact check the reality of these narratives that are being played. And so for me, the so what of what happens with higher education and people not trusting that as an institution of higher learning is the consequence of not having yet another stable institution of trust that we need to be able to be a resilient society in the United States. So I've talked to you about 3 trends and the future of work and how I think extremists are using them. I wanted to just leave you with some efficacy of what you yourselves could be doing about this. The first one I think is easy, right? And that is to come to things like this, right? Engage with experts in extremism. Think about how things that happen in your everyday life or third-order effects of technology that you use could be used from a malevolent actor, and being aware of that. We have a listserv. I'll put it on the last slide here. Maybe Dean Wheeler could share it with you all in some communication. If you're interested in getting some of our communication products, signing up for some of our webinars, we have one next week on the vicarious trauma that terrorism researchers and students who are studying this kind of work can experience from looking at it. I think it actually has pretty broad application for the media right now. Just us learning about what's happening in Israel and Palestine can cause some secondary trauma just reading it. This is our red teaming of technology. So we did an exercise up at the National Counterterrorism Center in McLean, Virginia, where we brought a bunch of extended reality devices and had their experts sort of red team and think about, okay, if I have seen terrorists use this type of technology to plan an attack, how is that going to be enhanced if I'm in the metaverse? So being able to see that kind of work as well. The last one is promoting collaboration. So if you are one of those organizations that's endorsing hybrid work, use that extra money to have some team buildings where people actually get to feel connected to their institutions. And then supporting higher ed. You're here today. If you're one of those companies who's no longer requiring a bachelor's degree for working there, reimagine what higher ed could be for you, whether it be a micro-credential, whether it be coming for exec ed. But think about higher ed as a place for your workforce to be able to develop those community resilient skills as well. So with that, this is my contact information. Dean Wheeler obviously knows how to get a hold of me at any time, so please follow up if you have any questions. But just wanted to thank everyone for their time and attention, and if there are any questions, you can stick around after. I don't want to have everybody feel like they have to be here, but if you have a question for me, now's the time, right?
Do we have any questions? I didn't mention this might be a more challenging Q&A than when you're testifying before Congress.
I don't know.
Gina, Dr. Ligon was in the White House a couple weeks ago as well, so I don't know if this is as stressful, but maybe.
I was wearing the same suit.
Get a picture. Does anyone have any questions? I've got a microphone. I can run it back to you.
I look around, I see a lot of college-age students. I don't remember when I was in college age, when I was on a train or airport where the responsibility was on me to look around and report if something looked odd, right? That's something that's been, I guess, around for a few years now. But now we're also being asked in our workplace to look around and see if there's anything odd or think about these, traumatizing ideas, right? I imagine that for young people that could to increase a lot of anxiety, and we know that's a problem in our society anyway.
Yeah.
So, I mean, is there any place safe? You know, what advice would you give to younger and older folks with this, you know, the more and more out there that people can utilize for, you know, harm?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And one of the things that gives me hope, it's actually one of the researchers from American University who's going to present next week, but she's done a really good study about terror trauma that can be experienced and the anxiety that you're talking about from thinking about these issues. And one of the things that she's found is that when you prime people with thoughts of it is your responsibility, but also your power to be able to help keep your community safe and to help everyone here think about, like, it's not the government's job to keep us safe. They're going to they're going to fail, right? Like, you have to just accept that and know that who's going to keep my community safe is me. And that actually can reduce people's anxiety about it because they start to feel more efficacy that, like, I have a role in keeping my community safe in ways that the government just doesn't have the expertise to do or people in place to do. Good question.
Hello. Oh, hey. So I work with Amazon specifically in threat assessment protection. I'm involved with threat assessment professionals too. So first, thank you. This was very informative and really appreciated it. It's one of the reasons I came to this. But question for you. So we use, you know, different types of open source intelligence to kind of source social media to identify and then subsequently mitigate these threats and escalate out to law enforcement and federal agencies when you need to. So what kind of trends are you seeing towards some of these groups in social media? Are some more active, some less active? And then specifically Reddit. What kind of a wormhole do you guys see that being for this kind of stuff now and then as we go into the future? Because I know for us, Reddit is just a nightmare.
Yeah, it is. Talk about trauma and anxiety to look at that. But, you know, one of the things that's been really interesting after this conflict last weekend was just the amount of hashtag what's going on in Israel right now or what's going on in Gaza right now, and how neo-Nazi groups really usurped that hashtag to just have a ton of anti-Semitic stuff out there. And so I think that's one of the trends is when they're using these trending topics to be able to hijack and put in their own ideological spin or interpretation onto it has been really, so don't discount the mainstream. Like, they're not going to be obvious and be like down with Jews, right? Like, they're going to use the hashtags that are going to make you click on it or make it appear in your theme, in your feed, which you're probably aware of. With Reddit, also the other trend that we've looked at are the gaming adjacent platforms, which has been really interesting. So not gaming, but like Twitch or Discord, and that's like the Wild West. They're not regulated, they're not really observed. And so that's where we were seeing a lot of the acceleration is go to. So I wouldn't discount that as well for your work. And then if you're part of an ISAC, which is an industry security, I'm sure you are with Amazon, but it's something that's like an industry consortium that's supposed to be alerting industry partners of these threats. The problem is a lot of times it's the smaller than Amazons that are in position to observe it that aren't part of that. Thank you for the work you're doing.
Gina, are you able to comment on, you and I discussed, I don't know if you're able to comment widely on it, about the open source technology you had discussed. We had a conversation about farming and open sourced. I don't know if you're able to speak about that.
Yeah,
that's also a fascinating example.
So I live in Nebraska, right? And so we're really focused on protecting the food and water supply. It's our biggest part of our economy. And what's interesting is with this move to have open source code to improve precision agriculture and to make it more useful. It also allows for nefarious actors, both state and non-state sponsored actors, to be in there. And so one of the things that we are worried about from a regulation standpoint is like how we're protecting people who are in charge of our food from malign actors, because that's like a lot of times we think on the East Coast about the Amazons and about the BNSFs and about the airlines, but we don't think about the food supply. And so that's something that I'm really passionate about, is how all these protections we're putting in place, so we can't hijack planes through open source architecture, we should be putting in place for our food supply as well.
Other questions?
Hi, Jim.
I think I can do without the microphone. There's 330 million people in this country. How many of them, you take this a few groups, you kind of go to all the different subgroups. How many total are there in that
Yeah.
bucket?
Yeah, so I think that's a couple different ways I would answer that. One is how many would actually engage in violence versus how many would support others engaging in violence. So it's really interesting as First Amendment protected speech, right? Of like, you can be anti-Semitic in the United States. You can say things that are horrible about women or about minorities or people of color, just in general. That whole ecosystem of hateful speech, especially online, that is bigger than I think any of us recognize. Now, I don't think it's as big as there's some work that's come out of University of Chicago, specifically about anti-government beliefs. Bob Pape, his estimates are about 40% of Americans have these sort of anti-government belief systems. Now, would they enact in violence on behalf of those beliefs? I think that's a much smaller percentage. But the way I look at it as an org psychologist is like, if you have this, it's the false consensus effect, right? If you think everybody else believes that we should overthrow the government, but maybe you're the only one that's brave enough to do it, but you have the support of people around you, you're more likely to do it. So I actually think people that condone those violent beliefs publicly on social media or just in discourse or nodes of influence on the news, saying those kinds of things are very dangerous, because what happens is that smaller percentage, which is, extremism is a real low base rate phenomenon. It's about 5% of people that are actually going to engage in violence on behalf of a belief. But if they believe that everybody around them thinks they should, then they're more likely to engage in it. So I don't know if Bob Pape's numbers are right. We actually have a pretty big study going on right now. It's going to be in the 2023 census. We have some survey items in there about Americans' tolerance for violence, and I think that'll be a much better sample because it will go through the representation of the census to have those items, whereas he kind of went to neighborhoods where people that participated in January 6th and asked their neighbors, and so you're kind of sampling on the dependent variable there. So, there's some issues with his, but either way, it's more than 10, it's higher than we'd like. And so that's what's difficult about answering that question right now. But I do think both of those populations play a pretty important role in violence in America. Like, everyday Americans' tolerance for violence being higher now than it used to be is incredibly alarming.
So you were talking about there's a cloud effect in terms of how it is spread. So do you guys have an idea how this, how the streams goes and how those connections are made?
In social media, yeah. So some of the social network scholars that are in our consortium are looking at resonance of a tweet or an idea, and also humans' likelihood of trusting that tweet or idea, which is really interesting. They're actually studying it with conspiracy theories, which is not necessarily the same, but it is related to violence. And so there's a couple different features of a conspiracy theory that make it more palatable, and part of it is people have this need to be the first to share. And so when that happens, when they feel like it's an exclusive piece of information that no one else knows, they have this need to share it out with their family so they can be the first to know. And then those people feel that way and they feel compelled to share. So there's features of the information, I think, more so than the mechanics of the platform. But at the same time, there's also work happening, and this is not happening in our consortium, it's actually happening at University of Pennsylvania, about the algorithms that the social media companies have created that have these second order effects, right? Of you then now get to see more and more extremist content if you hover on an image too long. Which is why I have like a totally different account for when I look at extremist content, because I don't want it to show up on my normal Instagram feed. So, great question.
Other questions? Yeah. I need it.
Thank you very much for coming. It was extremely important for us to hear. We were having a conversation this morning about the use of AI in healthcare.
Okay.
And so as we are beginning to more rapidly adopt AI, what are the areas that we should be concerned about from malicious use? You know, we recognize obviously that there's risk there, but don't yet know what those risks could be.
Yeah, I mean, for us looking at the idea that you can search something for malign uses and it not trigger anyone in law enforcement, that's what's called it's called a SAR report, suspicious activity report. So we're really good at flagging like when someone makes a weird financial transaction with the bank because of the regulation around banking. We actually got pretty good during 2014, 2016 with foreign terrorist travel. So like if someone were to search how to get to Turkey cheaply, that was one of the key search terms that people were using to get into the conflict in Syria. With the questions that like the ones I showed you and probably the ones you're grappling with in healthcare, you know, like about toxicity and about lethality of certain combinations of drugs, there is no trigger yet set up to alert anyone in law enforcement that that could actually be a malign use. And part of it is because of the open architecture of the different AI platforms that exist. The other piece is that you can there's some new innovations about taking those completely offline. So you would actually you go down and store all of the information that was needed about a certain toxin, and you could take it offline and do all of your searches and no one would be able to track it. So I think the two pieces for me is not having suspicious activity reporting mechanisms in place in our federal government that are keeping step with this emerging tech. And the second one is when people go dark and are able to disguise what they're doing. So it's actually easier once we get that SAR stuff in place, it'll be easier. Right now, we don't, but once we get SAR reporting in place for that, and there's some right triggers, I think it's good, but then that's when these groups are going to be able to take all that information offline and just use a natural language processing that's not even connected to the internet. So those two things I worry about.
Because of the privacy concerns, I think most healthcare organizations are looking at private tenants to be able to use, so the data wouldn't be accessible, nor the queries, I would imagine, would be accessible across the internet. So it begs the question in my mind about what types of reporting do we need to have in order to try to identify that suspicious activity.
Yeah, and just thinking about programs that you already have in place for insider threat, like you're very good. Healthcare has developed some great programs about use of opioids and stealing of drugs that are on site. So maybe being able to, thinking of HR and dual use some of those programs for this same cause, I think would be an incredibly innovative way to counter it and this is where the innovation will happen as industry, right? Like it's not going to happen from the government thinking of these things. It's going to happen from you thinking of the benevolent ways that you can use this technology and then thinking of, okay, what are the safeguards we need to put in place in case we have an insider threat here who's using it. So I'm excited that you're thinking along those lines. That's really hopeful.
We have time for one more. Yeah, or two more. We can do two. One here. I'll get you next.
Hi, so I study environmental health and sustainability management. So I'm interested in learning like how the actual environment around us influences our psychology and way of thinking. So have you come about any information on the increase of like our natural disasters or just the increase of pollution as we've seen with like forest fires and everything, the increase on that? Are they like actually increasing or impacting extremist ways of thinking, or is it increasing the attention to conspiracy theories?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a whole special issue dedicated to one of our journals, Terrorism and Political Violence, about the nexus between climate change and extremism. And one of the things, most of those articles were about displacing populations and what that's going to do for the migration crisis. And that is something you're probably very well attuned to. But there were no articles in that special issue about what you just described, which is sort of the salience and availability of fodder for conspiracy theories. So I think that is an under-researched area that, I mean, you should do it for your thesis. I don't know, like it's a cool question that I mean, I'm not saying I know every piece in the terrorism literature, but I had not come across anyone who studied that, but it's really smart.
So one of the things that you said that stuck with me was that radical racist supremacy groups, like basically white supremacy was one of the biggest groups that behind terrorism. So when we look at terrorist events like 9/11, we have security measures that were put in place to protect people after. So that's where we got like TSA, these large sparks of security. So what is the next step in protection, or what does it look like for protection in minorities when we know and we acknowledge federally that this group or these racist extremists are the biggest threat?
Yeah, I am proud to say that in 2021, this administration released the first ever domestic terrorism strategy in the United States. Proud in that this administration did it. Sad because it took so long, because those of us who've studied this have known that white supremacy, accelerationism, terrorism is the most lethal threat in the United States, but I think it took this administration to get in place to actually put some data and some numbers around that. There are 4 pillars to that strategy, one of which is, I think, putting protections in place, both from an education standpoint around what are some of the vulnerabilities for people, the targets of these violent events, and then also what are some ways that we can provide more grant programs to places where these targets are congregating, so houses of worship, HBCUs. I'm really happy this year we have a call for our, if you're passionate about this, I'd encourage you to look at it, but we have a call for a proposal about how you can protect minorities in institutions of higher ed. And I'm hoping we can get some of the best researchers in the country to apply to that. But there's more grant money to study, like ways that we can actually make some meaningful security protections around it, which is what it took for TSA and FEMA to stand up after 9/11 as well. So right now, the most important thing is there's federal attention on it. There's a whole task force about it, and there's more money to be held to study what are the right protections. But I think you are going to see a sea change because of that national domestic terrorism strategy that named RIMB extremism as the most lethal threat to the United States. So thank you for your question.
Well, I want to thank you all for attending the keynote address. I especially want to thank Dr. Gina Ligon for taking the time and making the trip to come and speak with us. I hope it was thought-provoking. I hope you all walk away from today with different thoughts and thinking about what your future might be and what the future of your community, your country, and this world might be after today's conference. So, Gina, thank you so much.
Thank you. I know. The famous lady was there.